Hello, my name is Father Tighe, and this is our 124th segment of our journey of faith in the light of the cross. And if we look up on our screen, we see our theme, which challenges you. We see the theme is Stephen said in Acts of the Apostles, chapter 7, Israel had rejected Joseph and all of God's favorites who lived by faith in the inheritance promised. But just as God redeemed Joseph's rejection by his brothers, so were Jesus and Stephen ready for Israel's rejection, but also God's redemption. How do we put this all together? We go to our next screen and we read just two verses from Acts. Stephen says in Acts 7:9, the patriarchs, the brothers of Joseph, out of jealousy sold Joseph into slavery. But God granted him favor and wisdom, that's important, before Pharaoh, who put him in charge of his household. This is interesting. How does Joseph enter into Pharaoh's household? Now the theme, the domesticated get the inheritance. This is very important. Stay around the house and you'll get the inheritance. Why was it easy for Joseph to get close to Pharaoh's household? Because Joseph was domesticated, cultured, and non-threatening. That's very important. Now we review the story of Joseph in Genesis, but we review first Jacob could deceive Isaac because he was in his tent near Rebekah, his mother, who heard Isaac command Esau to go hunt and prepare a meal for the blessing. So because they were near Isaac in his tent, they heard it and they were able to jump in while poor Esau was out hunting. Secondly, Joseph penetrated Pharaoh's house because he looked like a non-threatening house slave. Third, as Rachel's firstborn, Joseph received the blessing over his older brothers born to Leah. So Joseph was trained by a pedagogue to cultivate and not squander the family inheritance. And this is segment 25, Paul's letter to the Galatians, which is very important. Now we go to Joseph in Genesis. We read here in chapter 39, verse 1, one of Pharaoh's eunuchs, and eunuch is a very important word, though you'll find it in very few translations, but saris in Hebrew and eunuchos in Greek, which we get from the Septuagint, which Stephen is using and the people are hearing, they use the word eunuch. Potiphar was the eunuch, and he bought Joseph to be his slave. But Yahweh was with Joseph, so he prospered in Potiphar's house. Joseph was not depressed and discouraged. He did a good job immediately. Potiphar saw quickly that Joseph was a house slave with great managerial skills. When Potiphar saw God made him successful, he even made him his personal attendant. So Joseph is not that obnoxious character who shoved the tunic and his dreams in his brother's face. Now he makes people comfortable, so they're not afraid to be close to him. With Joseph managing his household, he had no concerns, he had no worries, for Joseph's morals and integrity won him trust. We go on to our next screen. Joseph was good-looking and attractive. Now, this may mean big and handsome. That doesn't, because they're exactly the same words as 29:17, the exact Greek and Hebrew words used to describe his mother, Rachel. Okay? So he could have been slim and fine-featured. So Potiphar's wife said, "Lie with me." He refused, saying, "My master has withheld nothing from me but you, his wife. How could I commit such a wrong and be condemned before God?" He was very conscious of God's presence, which kept his spirits up. But one day when the house was empty, she grabbed his cloak and said, "Lie with me." But he left the cloak in her hand and ran outside. We go to our next screen and we read. When Potiphar returned, she told him, "Your Hebrew slave broke in to play with me." Now the word play is translated mock or insult, but Robert Alter in his translation says the Hebrew intends this as a double entendre, a play on words. He came in to play with me, but I screamed. He left his cloak and fled. His master was enraged, or he acted enraged. Joseph was thrown into the jail of the royal prisoners. This is a strange jail. Potiphar and his wife were play acting. It was a charade. So Joseph went to the royal detention house. It's more a detention center than a jail, where he was well treated, for the jailer knew Potiphar's game. We go on to the next screen. Joseph's background enabled him to fit easily into a domestic world dominated by eunuchs. The household of Pharaoh was dominated by eunuchs because that's the only people he trusted, not only sexually, but physically and probably politically. Potiphar, probably a eunuch after he married, and feeling inadequate, artfully put Joseph and his wife together and then disappeared. But Joseph knew the deceits of a household world. He knew Potiphar or his wife could turn at any time and have him severely punished, if not put to death. With faith in God's favor and wisdom, Joseph resisted. Now we go to our next screen and we read 39:21. Yahweh abided with Joseph in prison, for the chief jailer favored him. Joseph is put in prison. God says there must be an opportunity here, so Joseph's spirits were up and he did a good job. He put Joseph in charge to manage the jail. The jailer was free of concern, for even the jail prospered under Joseph's care. God's favorite do a good job wherever they are, and they're not depressed and discouraged. Now we go to chapter 40, verse 1. Now Pharaoh was angry with two of his eunuchs, so he put them in the same place, the detention center, jail, as Joseph. The chief steward made Joseph their attendant, so he personally took care of these upper crust, two eunuchs who had high positions. Joseph interpreted later their dreams and won the cupbearer's promise to promote him to Pharaoh. We go on to the next screen. Genesis 40. Pharaoh invited all his eunuchs to his birthday party. Sounds over-domesticated himself. And he restored the cupbearer, who forgot to tell Pharaoh about Joseph. 2 years later, Pharaoh had a dream and no one could interpret it, but then the cupbearer remembered Joseph and he told him to promote me to Pharaoh. He told Pharaoh about Joseph. He summoned Joseph and said, I hear you interpret dreams. Joseph replied, it is not I, but God who will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. We go to our next screen. And we know the story. We're not going to go into it. Joseph predicted 7 years of feast and 7 years of famine. And then he said to Pharaoh, let Pharaoh set a wise man over your land to gather food during the 7 good years as a reserve for 7 bad years. Pharaoh was pleased and said, can we find anyone more full of God's Spirit than Joseph? Joseph was up and doing a good job wherever he was. So he said to Joseph, you shall manage my house and my people. Joseph was 30 years old at the time, and he had 2 sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. Now, these fathered tribes equal to the 12 brothers. You notice there's no tribe of Joseph. There's 2 tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh. Very important. Now we go on to our next screen. And we review. Stephen said Israel had rejected Joseph and all of God's favorites over the centuries, who lived in faith in the inheritance promised. As God redeemed Joseph's rejection, so were Jesus and Stephen ready for Israel's rejection, but also God's redemption. Thank you so much for joining us as we join in the spirit of Joseph and we look for that promised land. We're wayfaring strangers, you and I, but we're looking for that promised land where we'll live in glory with God and nothing discourages us on our journey. Thank you so much for joining us for this 124th segment.
Just going over Jordan. I am just going over home. I am just going.